Hello and welcome back to another exciting lecture in geomorphology. We're going to be continuing on with our discussion of drainage basins today, and we're going to be looking at drainage basin landforms. So that's our goal for today, is thinking about different types of landforms that we find in drainage basins associated with fluvial processes. So that's our goal for today. Behind us, we're looking at the spectacular river terraces we'll be learning about today here on the Potomac River in the eastern United States. Everyone sees these flat surfaces. We've got one right here, flat surface there. Then we've got some other lower flat surfaces. So these are strath terraces. They're evidence of former channels of a river. So that's our goal today, to look at just a couple of these features. So let's look at the first one, and that's one of these spectacular features. Oh my gosh, look at that. Yes, a waterfall. But we're going to use a fancy word here. We're not going to just call it a waterfall. What do geomorphologists call a waterfall? You got it. This is a nick point. So a nick point occurs where we have an abrupt change in elevation of a fluvial channel, hence a waterfall, high elevation to low elevation. There are many different causes of nick points that can help us to understand the geomorphic history of a region. This particular one is from Iceland right here. Okay, so generally we divide nick points into two forms. If you have a discrete step waterfall in the channel, like right here, we call this a nick point. If we get instead just a section of the river that's oversteepened relative to above and below, we'll call that a nick zone. So it's an oversteepened reach versus a discrete nick point. I really like this diagram here from your textbook because it shows you very clearly how we can get a nick point developed on a stream. And this is a classic one, and this is really important for a lot of waterways near coastal regions where we've had changes in sea level. You guys are probably sick of me talking about the LGM, right? The LGM this, the LGM that. I'm always talking about the LGM, the last glacial maximum. And during this time of the LGM, we had large continental glaciers over North America. In the west, we had the Cordilleran ice sheet. In the east, we had the Laurentide ice sheet, right? And so when you've got all that mass of ice up on the continent, you actually have removed enough water to change the elevation of the oceans. The ocean levels go down during these glacial periods. And so, 21,000 years ago, sea level was about 100 meters lower than it is today. And so rivers were draining to a lower elevation. And then as sea level comes up, we've got a new elevation. So this is a really important concept I want you to remember. And that's the point to which a river flows. We're going to talk a lot about this in drainage basins. This is what we call the base level. It's the lowest point to which a stream can erode. Base level. And so ultimate base level for a stream is the ocean, but that base level might be different in other higher up in a drainage basin. You might have local controls on the base level. But look at how this change in base level creates a nick point. So imagine that we had higher oceans, right? So the ocean levels were higher. Where's my pen? Here it is. See if I can get this going real quickly. Of course not. Trying to get my pen to come up. Just bear with me for 1 second. Okay. So imagine that our old base level, this is when the ocean was higher, up at this level where the black line is, okay? So that's our old ocean level right here. We had higher sea level. And so our stream was graded with that concave stream profile where streams get less steep as they go lower in the drainage basin. It was graded to that higher base level. Now all of a sudden we drop sea level. So say you enter a glacial period, sea level goes down. And as we do that, all of a sudden the stream is going to be very, very oversteepened right here, right at the mouth of the old base level. And so what happens is that stream starts to erode, and that nick point will migrate up the stream. So a migrating nick point up the stream. And then if sea level were to go back up, then you would have this buried underwater old river channel. So nick points versus nick zones here. Great. Okay. Nick points can be at many, many different scales. You can have a really small nick point. Here we've only got a nick point of a couple of meters. Maybe this is caused by a change in the bedrock lithology, the rock type. This rock up here is a little more resistant than this one down here. And so we end up having a little nick point as we erode more effectively down here in the softer rock. So you could have a nick point form by rock type, or you can have really large rock, very large nick points like you see right here. A spectacular example of a nick point. Does everyone know this one? Yeah, that's right. This is Multnomah Falls in the Columbia River Gorge. And so this nick point is associated with another drainage basin landform, gorges, that we're going to talk about just in a second. And essentially, what's happening is up above the gorge, we have a different base level than where the Columbia River is cut through the gorge. And so the water is flowing over that right as it's flowing down into the gorge. Okay, just wanted to show you some pictures here of two different types of nick points that I've worked on in the same stream system. So these are bedrock streams in Erie, Pennsylvania. These are steep streams that are draining down into Lake Erie. And here we're looking at Sarah Finger, who did a little work on these streams and measuring these nick points. Does everyone notice this bottom picture here? This rock that is kind of well exposed is kind of a little nick point. Did everyone see that? This is a siltstone layer. And so the it's more of a sandstone, excuse me. The sandstone is more resistant than the underlying shales. And so it kind of gets holed up by erosion. It can't erode as much. And so it takes a while for the stream to cut through it. And we've produced that nick point. So this would be the sandstone here and then the softer shales underneath. When the river finally cuts through, it's easy to quickly erode, but it gets hung up. Our erosion gets hung up on that resistant sandstone. And we produce a nick point. This other type of nick point here where we've got this really steep cliff, and actually it's all shales here. There's no sandstones. This is where we have a fault. We've had a fault across the channel here, and it's busted up the rock and made it really easy to erode down on this side down here, and we've developed a nick point. So a nick point by faulting that breaks up the rock and makes it easier to erode, and then rock type itself having differential erosion rate. Okay, let's go to everyone's favorite nick point. Niagara Falls, yes, of course, famous Niagara Falls. This is a nick point too, and this nick point's really, really interesting. This nick point is associated with essentially a river, the Niagara River, that's been flowing over a more resistant bed, and then where it's broken across, because you've got dipping bedding here. On the other side, there's more easily erodible rock shales, and so you end up creating essentially this scarp. Does everyone see this scarp right here, which is this more resistant bed? It's I think a limestone bed. So this is essentially what Niagara Falls is. And interesting, Niagara Falls is actually retreating back up the Niagara River as it erodes right there at the nick point. And so eventually it's going to erode all the way up. If you run the model forward over, 10,000 years, then Niagara Falls will erode up the Niagara River to Lake Erie, and then Lake Erie will be catastrophically drained down into Lake Ontario. So something to keep an eye out for in about 15,000 years. Okay, my next drainage basin landform for you are gorges. I'm not going to say too much about gorges other than describing their morphology. It's where you have a very, very steep bedrock canyon that has been fluvial eroded. So these are often very, very V-shaped, these gorges. And two examples here for you. One from Vermont, the Quechee Gorge, which was carved by rapid meltwater flowing out of a post-glacial lake associated with the Laurentide ice sheet, eroded this gorge really quickly. And then the Verdun Gorge, one of the deepest gorges in Europe. It's in France, and this has been carved by river incision associated with glaciers as well. So these are gorges. And then I've taken us far away, but let's come back local here. Probably the most spectacular example of a gorge close by is the Columbia Gorge. Oops, sorry about that. The Columbia Gorge here, where we have the Columbia River, and the Columbia Gorge is where the Columbia River is cutting essentially through the Cascade Mountains. As the Columbia River goes from the east to the west side of the state, it has to go through the mountains. It cuts through the mountains. we've talked about this with antecedent drainage basin landforms. How does a river cut through a mountain? A mountain's up here. A river can't like try and erode up on top of a mountain. That doesn't make sense. Yeah, you're right again. Nice job. Antecedent, thinking about transverse landforms. The river, Columbia River, was already going out to the Pacific Ocean. Then the Cascades come up and it cuts through. So remember that the Columbia River Gorge was essentially predates the Missoula flood. Sometimes people get confused and think about the Missoula floods as carving the Columbia River Gorge. No, they flowed through the gorge, but the gorge was already cut. The gorge predates the Missoula floods. I'm going to post a nice little extra credit video for you guys if you want to watch about, or not extra credit, but an extra video. You don't have to watch it on the gorge. That's the Columbia River Gorge. Okay, our next landform is something I've already talked about briefly when we were talking about transverse drainage patterns. Everyone remember this map right here? That's right, this was the Huerfano River, and the Huerfano River used to flow across the top of the screen here. And then what we had was a piracy event where Muddy Creek captured the Huerfano River right here. And so now the Huerfano River flows off this way, and we've abandoned the old river courseway. Does everyone see these flat surfaces right here? It's this big, broad, flat surface, and it's a topographic high, right? This is a topographic high. It's lower over here. That's right. These are the old river channels. They're abandoned, and an abandoned river channel as the river cuts down is called a terrace. So these are terraces, and this low terrace here is probably about 700,000 years old. And so this represents a very, very old river courseway of the Huerfano River, and it's in size much lower than that today. So river terraces, and here's another terrace. This is from Cache Creek in northeastern Yellowstone, is the former river channel. So the river used to be at this elevation. It's in size down to this lower elevation here, abandoning this surface up here, and we end up with a river terrace. So terraces are erosional features. They tell us about the previous position of a river vertically in a landscape. So here's the sketch from your textbook. When we have terraces, the type of terrace I just described would be an erosional terrace as our river is cutting down. And so as rivers cut down, if they basically plane off and leave bedrock at the surface, we call this a strath terrace. There might be a smear, there we go, a smear of sediment on there. As everyone see, just this little bit of river channel sediments on top of the bedrock. That's okay. This would be a strath terrace when you have very thin sediments and it represents overall down cutting. A fill terrace would be a depositional terrace where the river has aggraded. And so in this case, the river was lower. It aggraded up to this high elevation, creating a fill. We call that a fill terrace. And then if we incise down into that fill and create a step, in that fill, that would be this right down here. We would call this a fill cut terrace. So these bottom ones here where the river's cutting back down is a fill cut. Now I'm going to sketch this out on the whiteboard too. Fill. Okay. Another terminology here is when your streams are incising. If you have two terraces that are at equal elevation that formed on the same time on both sides of the river, that would be a paired terrace. So your river has a terrace up here and then it cuts down into the middle down here. If it erodes off on one side and only leaves a terrace on one side of the valley, we call that an unpaired terrace. So paired and unpaired terraces. Here's some spectacular pictures. This is from your textbook of terraces as this river's in size. So we have one terrace here, and then this might be paired with something over here. We clearly have a paired terrace across the valley with this side and this side. And then note we have another terrace right here, another terrace right here. Those are likely unpaired terraces. And then we have a lower inset paired terrace down below. So these record the river cutting down into the landscape here. Again, these can be incredibly powerful for telling us about the response to the landscape over thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. It can tell us about climate. It can tell us about changes in base level. It can tell us about tectonics. So understanding the formation of terrace and dating terraces is really key to our understanding of geomorphic history. Here's another example of a terrace. And so we have a bedrock contact here, a shale sandstone contact. And then right here we have a strath terrace. And so right here, and then above that, we have a river gravel. And so here's the strath right here, and then a channel floodplain sediments on top. Or channel sediments, the coarse grain sediments, and then maybe some fine grain floodplain sediments right on the very top. Whoops, so my strath line's a little low. I've made this a little bigger. So the strath is up there. Strath terrace. Here are some strath terraces from the eastern United States again. Classic strath terrace. Again, we get lots of these straths in, this is the Susquehanna River, I believe. A lot of these straths are associated with changes in base level associated with glacial conditions. Here's a nice fill terrace. So the river filled to this high elevation here. So this would be a fill terrace, and then the river cut down to this lower elevation and created a fill cut terrace. So fill versus fill cut terrace. When you're thinking about terraces and whether a river is going to grade or degrade, come back to your good friend here, Stan Shum's stream balance. This is a great way about thinking about how a river is going to incise or grade and make terraces. So for example, if you have a river system that has lots of bed load in it, then all of a sudden you remove that bed load, this thing, you take the bed load away, it's going to tip. It's going to, this side of the balance over here is going to go up, and this is going to tip towards degradation. A great example of that would be these river terraces on the Madison River. Does everyone see each of these terraces here? Terraces on the Madison. This is down cutting of the Madison River, and what we're looking at is essentially during the deglacial times, as we're removing ice from the landscape at the LGM, our rivers are full of sediment, and then as that sediment yield declines, we have still high discharges, and the rivers cut down into those fill terraces. Hi everyone, thanks for being here. We're back. We're just going to come over to the board now and think a little bit more about terraces and the formation of strath terraces, fill terraces, and fill cut terraces. So let's just kind of sketch out what this looks like in cross-sectional form in a landscape. So let's say we have a nice flat block here. This is going to be our top of our landscape here. We got a little river that's here, and it really hasn't started anything yet. This, let's just say this is a nice fresh uploaded block of a mountain. This is all bedrock here. Okay. Let's say that our river now incised down. So our river is going to incise down and cut into our bedrock. Let's say the river cuts down and cuts a narrow gorge. You guys have a new geomorphology term, or maybe not. I forget when this video is going to be cut into the class. But now we've got this little gorge here, right there. And let's have a red working, and it's dried out. I have a brown, murky river today. Okay. So let's say now that we end up with lateral migration of the channel, and so it starts to cut back and forth across this landscape and widen out a valley. Cut all the way across over the margins of our block, let's say. Okay, and let's say the river now it's at this level. Let's make it a little lower, even than that. So it's right at that level. And let's say as the river's doing that, it's deposited just a thin smear of sediment across the surface as it's done this. And so this is kind of active floodplain of the river as it's moving back and forth across the landscape. Okay, so there it is. Those are our channel sediments and our overbank deposits on the sides of the channel. Let's say that once again, this river, for some reason, think about Stan's Shum's balance, incises again. The river incises again. Our river cuts down. Let's say it cuts to right here, elevation. And there's our river today. There. Okay. I'm going to put kind of just the top on this now. Indicate that it's abandoned. We formed a river terrace. The river is now down here, and we have a terrace up here. What type of terrace is this? It's a thin gravel cap on an extensive, broad kind of bedrock feature. This is a strath terrace. When we name terraces, we call the highest ones T1. So let's call that T1 as we incise down. Now let's say the river then goes through a period of widening. So it starts cutting back and forth again. And it cuts across here. Like so. So we've just got just a little hint of T1 on the other side of the valley there. The river deposits more sediment at its new location. And then let's say the river once again incises once more, cuts down in its gorge. New channel down there. We abandon this former river floodplain here. We form a second strath terrace. That we will call T2. T2. Let's say our river laterally migrates once again. Let's say this time it planes off everything on that side. Fair amount here. So that our river is now planed out this nice surface here. So we have a T1 and a T2 terrace, and our river is at this low elevation. Let's say now that something changes in the balance. Perhaps we increase sediment yield, and now the channel starts to aggrade. We actually start to deposit more sediment than the river can transport. We start stacking up over time all this sediment, filling the channel. We end up with a new location of our river that's flowing now, and it's become an alluvial river. It's flowing in its own sediments. So we've got a fill. We've filled the valley. Now it's not a terrace yet because now the river's at this elevation. But let's say the river starts to incise once again. And so it incises down into our fill. like this. We've abandoned this surface. This would be our third terrace, and this would be a fill terrace. Okay. Now let's say, once again, this is a dynamic river here. It incises once again. So the river cuts down. Let's say it erodes all the way down and cuts into some of this bedrock down here. Make it even a little lower. How about that? There's our river channel right there. Notice right here, we've abandoned another terrace. This would be our T4. And this would be a fill cut terrace. Fill cut terrace. So every time the river abandons the channel and leaves it high and dry where it no longer can reach it, we create a terrace. In this case, we've got a paired terrace at T1, an unpaired T2 strath, a paired T3 terrace, and then that is a fill terrace, and then an unpaired T4 that is a fill cut terrace. And so for each of these, I could draw a direction of what the net channel is doing at that time. So the strath, the channel is going down at T1. At T2, the channel is going down. At T3, the channel is going up. And then at T4, channel is going up. So that's it. That's the model I keep in my head all the time for thinking about terraces. You pair that with Stan Shum's balance, and you have a powerful, powerful conceptual model for understanding how rivers work and how rivers are going to respond to external forces like logging, climate change, forest fires, all of that. So keep this in mind. This is really important for our understanding of how rivers work and erode and grade landscapes. All right, that's all I've got for you. Let me put my caps back on so my markers aren't dry for next time. And I lost one. Oh, there it is. All right, take care all. We'll see you. So those of you that know me know that I love alluvial fans. Alluvial fans are spectacular features. Alluvial fans are almost like deltas, except it's where you're dumping sediment out above water. A delta would be underwater, and we get alluvial fans where you have a steep mountain front that hits a flat valley floor. And so up in the steep mountain front, your river has lots of energy, lots of shear stress, and so it can transport that sediment. But once that river hits the flat valley floor, it no longer has the velocity and the shear stresses. It can't hold that sediment in suspension anymore, and it dumps out and it forms an alluvial fan. Now, fans have an actual fan shape because you get multiple depositional periods every time it floods and dumps out sediment, and you'll over time stack up sediment on different sides of the fan. So here, this is probably the most famous alluvial fan you'll ever see. This is in Death Valley. It's the Badwater fan on near the lowest point in the United States. And so as sediment comes down, it hits the Badwater basin right here, and all of a sudden you no longer have energy in your stream, and so you dump sediment out. And maybe in one time you dump debris flow here, and then the next debris flow that side's a little bit higher, so you dump sediment off on this side, and you continue with that process. So multiple depositional events create this cone and fan shape. And then, of course, the road here, the road is contouring. It's staying at the single elevation on the side of the fan. It kind of highlights that it's steep when you go up over these fans. In my Mojave class, we actually hike right up and look at these fan sediments right here on the Badwater fan. I say this is the most famous probably fan because of the road. This is probably in every introductory textbook. This is the picture they use for fans. Here are some fan sediments from the Mojave Desert. Oftentimes these are fluvial or mass movement in nature. They can be sheet wash floods or they can be debris flows. So you can often find like big boulders in these things if you've got a debris flow that dumps out on your fan. So here's the Mojave Desert class right here inspecting these fan sediments in the Mojave Desert a few years back. Okay, so alluvial fans occur in many environments. This would be an arid environment, but we also see alluvial fans in humid environments. So here's alluvial fans in Vermont. So these are small little features, but right there, does everyone see that little slope? That's an alluvial fan where sediment is being shed off these hill slopes and dumped out onto the valley floor or right next to this lake right here. Same thing, we can see coarse sediment in these fans associated with debris flows and maybe finer sediment associated with sheet floods. Oftentimes you'll have large fans that merge together. So you can see coalescing alluvial fans right here. So here's a fan, here's a fan, there's a fan. When they link together like this, we call this a bajada. So this is a bajada. Then we have this more young feature, an eruption of a cinder cone down here. But a bajada is where you have coalescing alluvial fans. Alluvial fans are really important because they're relatively flat, so people build on them. So here's the Rancho Mirage housing development. Does everyone see the shape right here? Yep, you guessed it. The Rancho Mirage housing development is situated on an alluvial fan. And so any debris flows up here are going to be coming down and being deposited on the fan. So these are very important landforms, and we have impacts, once again, of humans and nature on alluvial fans. So that's it. That's all I've got for you on alluvial fans right now. We'll come back and there'll be a video or some whiteboard work on terraces as well. So have a great day. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you soon. Bye.